You must understand, my friends, that the experience of spiritual disconnection is not merely a poetic metaphor or a psychological inconvenience. It is an existential fracture in the dialogue between the conscious self and the living, breathing depths of the psyche. When an empath feels disconnected, they do not merely lose clarity, they lose their inner axis. The compass that once pointed toward meaning, their inner world becomes opaque, as though the light behind their eyes has dimmed, and yet, paradoxically, it is in this dimness that the unconscious begins to speak more loudly, for the psyche never falls silent, it only changes its mode of communication. Many of you sitting here today feel this subtle absence, a sense that something essential has slipped just beyond the reach of your awareness. You sense a drifting, an estrangement from your own intuition, as though the once familiar current of inner knowing has become interrupted. But this interruption is not a punishment, it is an invitation, an archetypal summons to descend again into the depths where the self waits. For the empath, this summons is even more pronounced because your emotional antennae are not merely receptive, they are porous. You do not stand at the border of your psyche like a guarded sovereign. You stand there like an open gate, and when the gate is open too long, when you absorb too much of the world's pain without anchoring yourself back into the roots of your own being, the connection to the inner source begins to weaken. You become an instrument played by outer forces rather than an instrument guided by the inner musician. The spiritual disconnection of the empath is not a disconnection from the divine, it is a disconnection from the self, which is the channel through which the divine expresses itself. Consider for a moment the dream of a young woman who once came to me. She dreamt she was walking through a vast forest. At dusk, the trees had no leaves, yet they seemed to breathe, as though each trunk inhaled and exhaled. Softly, the forest floor was covered in fog, and she felt herself sinking with each step. She could hear a faint humming, like a distant choir underground, but she could not locate the source. As she continued, she came upon a river, black and still, reflecting nothing of the world above. When she tried to peer into it, she could see only her silhouette bending and warping, as though the water refused to reveal her face. Her dream ended with her calling out to a voice she could not name. This, I told her, was the dream of the disconnected empath, one who senses the presence of the unconscious but cannot yet retrieve its messages. The breathing trees were the living forces of the psyche, stripped of conscious meaning, yet pulsing with life. The fog was a confusion that arises when one absorbs too many emotions that are not one's own. The river was the threshold between the known and the unknown, the surface of the deeper self, and her inability to see her reflection was the very wound of spiritual disconnection. Her soul was present, but her awareness could not meet it. When we feel spiritually disconnected, we are not empty, We are full, too full, perhaps of unassimilated images, moods, and energies that belong not only to ourselves, but to the psychic field around us. Empaths are often unaware that their sensitivity makes them custodians of the emotional debris of others. You think the anxiety you carry is yours. Often it is not. You think your exhaustion is a result of personal failure. Often it is a symptom of psychic over-absorption. You think your confusion is proof of weakness. In truth, it is proof that you have wandered too far from the organizing center of the psyche. To heal spiritual disconnection, one must first acknowledge that the psyche has rhythms, seasons, and tides. You cannot always be connected. You cannot always hear the voice of intuition clearly. There are moments when your inner system shuts down temporarily in order to restore balance. Much like the forest in winter, these winters of the soul are not barren, they are protective. They pull you inward so that the soil of the psyche can regenerate. But the empath often interprets this winter as a sign that something has gone terribly wrong. You fear abandonment by your own spirit. Yet no abandonment has occurred. The self never leaves. It only retreats when the noise of the world grows too loud. It hides behind the threshold of consciousness not to punish you, but to encourage you to seek it. Spiritual disconnection is not a void, it is a veil. And behind the veil is the part of you that longs to be rediscovered. Let me tell you another story, a symbolic one, drawn not from a patient but from the universal imagery that visits every human soul. Imagine a village built beside a lake. Every morning, the villagers draw water from the lake, and this water sustains their life. But over time, the lake becomes polluted not by malice, but by neglect. Leaves fall into it, sedimenta cumulates, and soon the villagers begin to taste the difference. The water becomes heavy, dull, lacking the clarity that once nourished them. They blame the world, the sky, the storms, but the truth is simple. They have forgotten to tend to the lake. Your intuition is this lake. When you draw from it daily through reflection, solely to the honest emotional discernment, it remains clear. But when you allow unresolved emotions, the expectations of others, and the psychic residues of every person you encounter to accumulate within you, the waters become unclear. What you interpret as a failure of intuition is often simply a lack of inner hygiene. And yet, when an empath heals this disconnection, when the lake is cleared, the transformation is profound. Intuition does not merely return, it strengthens, it becomes luminous, decisive. But as he said, why? Because the empath's nature was never ordinary. You were not meant to sense the world with surface-level perception. You were designed to feel the undercurrents, the hidden meanings, the symbolic language beneath human interaction. You were designed to see the soul even when the eyes cannot, but you cannot see the soul of others clearly until you can see your own reflection in that inner river again. Intuition strengthens when the empath stops running from their inner world. Many of you unconsciously fear your own depths. You fear the magnitude of what you carry. You fear the intensity of your emotional resonance. You fear that if you enter the forest of your psyche, you may not return the same. And of course, you will not. That is precisely the point. The path of individuation requires that the old self dissolves so that the larger self may emerge. There is a reason spiritual disconnection is often accompanied by fatigue, apathy, or emotional disorientation. These symptoms are not weaknesses. They are psychic withdrawal. The unconscious is calling your energy inward so that transformation can occur beneath the surface. When the butterfly is in the chrysalis, it does not fly. When the psyche is reorganizing itself, your intuition becomes temporarily inaccessible. But when you emerge with a new symbolic language, a new depth perception, a new sensitivity to the meaning encoded in your experiences. I often said that the unconscious sends us symptoms when it cannot send us words. The empath's spiritual disconnection is one such symptom. It is the psyche's way of urging you to reclaim the parts of yourself lost in the emotional entanglements of your past. And here we must speak of the shadow, for the shadow plays a central role in intuitive blockage. The shadow is not merely the dark side of your personality. It is the repository of every unexpressed truth, every abandoned desire, every instinct you have been taught to fear. For the empath, the shadow is often gentle, not monstrous. It contains the anger you were not allowed to feel, the boundaries you never learned to set, the disappointment you swallowed to keep the peace. These forgotten forces clutter the inner lake with silt, preventing your intuition from reflecting clearly. But once the empath gathers the courage to confront the shadow, not with violence but with curiosity, the waters begin to clarify. You do not need to defeat the shadow, you need to dialogue with it. For intuition is not a magical gift. It is the natural result of harmony between the conscious and unconscious realms. When the shadow is acknowledged, the split within the psyche begins to mend, and when the split mends, intuition flows like a restored river, carrying messages from the depths to the surface with unbroken clarity. In this restoration, archetypes erwaken, the wise old man, the great mother, the inner child, the wounded healer. These primordial patterns rise from the unconscious and bring symbolic meaning back into your life. Dreams become vivid again. Synchronicities appear with uncanny precision. Emotional impressions gain significance rather than confusion. You begin to feel guided not by an external authority, but by the ancient intelligence within your own psyche. When the empath heals spiritual disconnection, what actually strengthens is not merely intuition, but the relationship between ego and self. The ego stops perceiving itself as a fragile entity lost in a hostile world and realizes it is the steward of a larger psychic field. You begin to understand that intuition is not a whisper from nowhere. It is the voice of the self breaking through the surface of consciousness. And when this voice returns, it carries a kind of certainty that defies logic, yet illuminates truth with astonishing accuracy. It is as though an inner light has been switched back on, allowing you to navigate life not by the flickering lantern of fear, but by the steady flame of inner knowing. You see, when an empath begins to heal the fracture of spiritual disconnection, something remarkable occurs deep within the architecture of the psyche. The inner chambers that once felt abandoned or silent begin to echo with subtle vibrations again. It is like entering a cathedral after years of believing it had been emptied of song, only to discover that the choir was never gone. They had simply been singing at a frequency you were too distracted to hear. This return to inner resonance is not abrupt. It begins as a faint stirring, a warm pulse behind the sternum, the sensation that something within you has begun to wake from a long and necessary sleep. Many people misunderstand intuition as a kind of supernatural ability, a gift bestowed only upon the chosen few. But intuition is far more ancient than that. It is the primordial intelligence of the psyche, the language of symbols and emotional truths that predates rational thought. When spiritual disconnection occurs, the channel of this ancient intelligence becomes obstructed, not because intuition disappears, but because the conscious mind becomes overloaded with noise. The empath, more than anyone, is vulnerable to this overload because your inner world is not sealed off, it is permeable, absorbing impressions and emotional energies like a sponge. But when healing begins, the sponge no longer sinks. It begins to release what it has absorbed. You may feel this as a sudden emotional purge, an unexpected wave of sadness, anger, or relief. This release is not regression, it is detoxification. The psyche cannot function with clarity if it is filled with unresolved fragments of other people's stories, other people's fears, other people's desires. You must return those energies to the world, not out of resentment, but out of necessity. For only when your inner vessel is emptied of what is not yours, can it be refilled with the wisdom that belongs to you. There is a dream I often recall when discussing this process, a dream shared by a man who believed for many years that he had lost all connection to meaning. In his dream, he found himself in a dimly lit library. The shelves were filled with books, but every spine was blank. And when he opened them, the pages were empty. The air smelled of dust and abandonment. As he wandered through the aisles, he felt a growing panic. He believed that these empty books represented the failure of his intuition, the collapse of his inner world. But then, at the far corner of the library, he noticed a single candle burning. The flame was small, trembling slightly, but unmistakably alive. When he approached, he saw that beside the candle lay an ink bottle and a quill. The message of the dream was clear. His intuition was not gone. It was waiting for him to write again. This is the truth. For many empaths, Your psychological library has not been destroyed, it has simply gone blank for a time, so that you can rewrite it with words that originate from your own soul rather than from the projections of others. Intuition strengthens when you reclaim authorship over your inner narrative. So long as your life is written by external influences, your inner voice cannot speak with authority. But once you begin to write from within, from the self, the words come with a clarity that astonishes even you. Healing the spiritual disconnection also reorders your perception of symbolic reality. You begin to recognize that the world is not merely a place of physical events, but a living tapestry of psychological forces. Every encounter becomes a mirror, every conflict becomes an archetypal dialogue. Every moment of serendipity becomes a whisper from the unconscious. This heightened symbolic awareness is not delusion. It is the natural state of a psyche that has re-established its connection with its own depth. You were always meant to live symbolically. The literal world is too small a container for the vastness of your inner life. When the empath's intuition awakens in this way, you may experience a sudden clarity about the emotional landscapes of others. But unlike before, when the sensitivity overwhelmed you, now it becomes organized. The empathy you once experienced as an unfiltered flood becomes a discerning instrument capable of distinguishing between your own emotional truth and the emotional truth of others. This discernment is the hallmark of healed intuition. It allows you to feel deeply without drowning, to understand without absorbing, to witness without collapsing into identification. But let us not forget that no spiritual reconnection occurs without confronting the deeper layers of the unconscious. You may find that during this process, dreams intensify, they become vivid, charged with mythic imagery, speaking in the language of symbols that bypass the rational mind and strike directly at the core of your being. These dreams are not random, they are the psyche's way of guiding you back to alignment. They reveal forgotten wounds, hidden desires, unexpressed potential. They illuminate the places where your life has grown fragmented and invite you to weave those fragments into wholeness. One night, a woman dreamt she climbed down a spiral staircase into a subterranean chamber. The walls were covered in ancient drawings, serpents, suns, moons, and human figures with wings. At the center of the room stood a stone basin filled with water, so still it looked like glass. When she bent over it, expecting to see her reflection, she instead saw a child with luminous eyes staring back at her. The child reached out a hand from beneath the water surface, and she woke in tears. This dream was not about regression or childishness. It was about the inner child archetype calling her back to innocence, back to the original intuition she once possessed, before the world taught her to distrust herself. Every empath carries such a child within them, a part of the psyche that once trusted its instincts completely, that once knew how to feel without fear, how to sense without intellectual distortion. Healing spiritual disconnection is often a journey back to that child, not to become naive again, but to retrieve the purity of intuition that has been buried under layers of adaptation, survival, and emotional compromise. When that child returns, intuition regains its clarity, because intuition is, at its essence, the unfiltered communication of the self to the conscious mind. But this reconnection does not happen only through light, it happens through darkness as well. The empath must make peace with the parts of themselves that they have demonized. Many empaths feel their own anger, believing it contradicts their identity as compassionate beings. Many fear their own desires, believing them selfish. Many fear their own intensity, believing it too much for the world. But these rejected parts become the very forces that sabotage your intuition. When you suppress an instinct, it does not disappear. It sinks into the unconscious and distorts your inner guidance. Anger, when acknowledged, becomes boundary. Desire, when integrated, become direction. Intensity, when embraced, become depth to heal a spiritual disconnection. The empath must reclaim these exiled energies, and when they return, intuition grows sharper because it no longer has to work around the barricades you placed within your psyche. A whole psyche perceives truth more easily than a fragmented one. The archetype of the wounded healer becomes especially active during this stage. You begin to understand that your sensitivity was never a flaw. It was a calling. Your wounds were not signs of weakness. They were initiation rites. Your periods of spiritual drought were not curses. They were thresholds through which you had to pass in order to access deeper layers of wisdom. When the wounded healer rises, intuition becomes not only a personal tool, but an instrument through which you can perceive the emotional patterns of others with uncanny depth. But unlike before, when such perception overwhelmed you, now it becomes a form of service, grounded, steady, and sovereign. Empaths often ask me why intuition feels stronger after a period of disconnection. The answer is simple. The psyche grows through contraction and expansion, through descent and ascent. Just as the lungs inhale only after exhaling, intuition returns stronger only after you have moved through the dark valley where the old self dissolves. This descent into darkness cleanses the psyche. It strips away illusions, dependencies, and false interpretations. It forces you to rely not on external guidance, but on the faint, persistent glow of inner truth that remains even when everything else collapses. And when you emerge from this descent, intuition no longer feels like something outside of you whispering its directives. It feels like something inside you speaking with quiet authority. There is no longer fear in its presence. There is no longer doubt. There is simply recognition and inner yes, a resonance that tells you when something aligns with your deepest nature. This is why the empath, once reconnected, becomes profoundly intuitive. You no longer rely on logic alone. You no longer rely on the emotional turbulence of others to give you direction. You rely on the silent compass within you, the one that was always there buried beneath layers of noise, fear, and emotional residue. Now, with the lake cleared, with the library rewritten, with the child retrieved, with the shadow integrated, the compass points directly toward the self. And so intuition becomes not a mystical talent, but a natural extension of your healed psyche. It becomes a form of inner vision. It becomes alignment. It becomes truth. As the empath continues, the sacred work of restoring the bridge between the conscious mind and the depths of the psyche, something profound begins to reshape the very orientation of their inner life. The spiritual disconnection that once felt like a silent void gradually reveals itself as a rite of passage, a symbolic death that prepares the ground for rebirth. This process is not dramatic in the way the ego imagines. It is subtle, quiet, like watching the first ripples form on a lake that has been still for years. But those ripples signal the return of movement, the return of life, and with it, the return of intuition in its most potent form. For the empath, intuition has always been intertwined with emotion. Yet emotion alone cannot guide you. It must be integrated with the wisdom of the unconscious. When you are disconnected, emotion becomes chaotic, unfocused, unpredictable. But when you heal, emotion transforms into a refined instrument of perception. You begin to sense the emotional truth beneath surface appearances. You feel not only what someone expresses, but what they conceal, what they fear, what they yearn for, what they have abandoned within themselves. And yet, unlike before, when this sensitivity overwhelmed you, now it becomes clear and manageable because it no longer mingles with your own unresolved wounds. Healing spiritual disconnection is equivalent to untangling 1,000 threads in the psyche. Each thread represents a story you carried that was not yours, a pain you inherited, a fear you internalized, a responsibility you assumed that belonged to someone else. The empath often becomes a psychological caretaker, not out of desire, but out of unconscious loyalty to the suffering of others. You learned early in life that to maintain harmony, you must absorb chaos. To maintain love, you must abandon yourself. To maintain connection, you must silence your intuition when it warns you of danger. But when reconnection begins, these threads unravel. You begin to see, almost with an inner vision, which emotions belong to you and which do not. You distinguish between your authentic intuition and the internalized voices that once controlled your perception. The empath's healing is thus a reclamation of the inner throne. You are no longer ruled by the fears of others, the projections of others, the needs of others. You begin to inhabit your own psychic territory with sovereignty. Let me illustrate this with another dream, one that reveals the internal shift that occurs when intuition begins to return. A man who felt spiritually lost told me of a dream in which he wandered through a vast mansion. Every room was filled with people arguing, voices overlapping, shouting, demanding attention. He felt overwhelmed, unable to think clearly. But then he discovered a narrow staircase leading to an attic. When he entered the attic, he found a single window overlooking the sea. The room was silent except for the soft sound of waves in the distance. As he approached the window, a voice behind him whispered, "This is where the truth lives." He turned, but no one was there. The mansion represented his psyche. The arguing rooms were the competing voices of external influences he had absorbed over his lifetime. The attic was the inner sanctuary of intuition, the highest vantage point from which he could observe life without distortion. The sea beyond the window symbolized the collective, unconscious, vast, eternal, rhythmic, and the voice that said, "This is where the truth lives," was the self, reminding him that clarity is found not in noise but in descent into solitude. Many empaths live their whole lives in those arguing rooms. They confuse empathy with enmeshment, compassion with self-erasure, connection with psychic overload. They believe they hear their intuition, but what they truly hear are the emotional echoes of others reverberating inside them, a spiritual disconnection. Therefore is the psyche's intervention. It is the unconscious, shutting down the doors temporarily, pushing you toward the attic where silence restores perception. Once you begin to operate from this inner attic, from this place of stillness and symbolic clarity, you experience a fundamental shift in how you relate to the world. The empath who once felt easily swayed by external energies becomes grounded. The empath who once felt overwhelmed becomes discerning. The empath who once lost themselves in the emotional turbulence of others becomes centered in their own essence. Intuition, in this phase, takes on a new character. It no longer arrives as a whisper of uncertainty, but as a steady inner knowing. You feel a resonance when something aligns with your truth, and a subtle contraction when it does not. This is the language of the self, communicating through sensation, through inner movement, through the symbolic intelligence of the body and psyche working in harmony. You are no longer guessing, you are recognizing. But this recognition requires one more essential step, the integration of the shadow. Spiritual disconnection often occurs because a part of the self has been exiled into the unconscious. The empath, in their desire to be good, kind, gentle, and compassionate, represses the aspects of themselves that they believe contradict these ideals. But the psyche does not tolerate one-sidedness. The parts you reject become the very obstacles that block your intuition. The anger you suppress becomes fog. The desire you fear becomes confusion. The assertiveness you bury becomes fatigue. The instincts you demonize become anxiety. To restore spiritual connection, you must reclaim these exiled energies. You must bring them home. And when you do, something extraordinary happens. Your intuition becomes multidimensional. It no longer operates only through empathy, but through instinct, discernment, clarity, and embodied presence. The shadow does not weaken intuition, it strengthens it. For intuition that excludes instinct is incomplete. Intuition that excludes desire is directionless. Intuition that excludes assertiveness is voiceless. When all these parts return, you become whole. And wholeness is the true source of intuitive power. There is another story I must share, one that reflects the moment when intuition transforms from a fragile sensation into an unshakable inner compass. A woman once told me she felt as though her life had been guided entirely by the expectations of others. She made every decision based on what would cause the least conflict, not on what resonated with her soul. When she finally collapsed into spiritual exhaustion, she believed she had failed. But in that collapse, she began to dream of a wolf standing at the edge of a frozen lake. The wolf stared at her with fierce, knowing eyes. She felt both terrified and mesmerized. Night after night, the wolf appeared, each time closer, each time more insistent. Finally, she gathered the courage to approach it. When she did, the wolf spoke. "You have forgotten your own nature." This wolf was not a threat. It was her shadow, her instinct, her forgotten strength. When she embraced it, she discovered that her intuition had always been present, but she had ignored it because it did not speak with the gentle voice she expected. It spoke with the voice of inner authority, of primal truth, of sovereignty. And once she accepted this voice, she became grounded, decisive, and clear in ways she had never imagined possible. Her intuition was not reborn, it was unleashed. This is the destiny of every empath who heals spiritual disconnection. You do not become less sensitive, you become more powerful. You do not feel less, you feel with greater accuracy. You do not withdraw from the world, you move through it with clarity, intention, and depth. You become someone who sees not only with the eyes but with the soul. Yet there's one more dimension of this healing that must be explored, the reconnection to the symbolic field. When intuition strengthens, reality itself appears different. Coincidences become meaningful. Encounters feel orchestrated. Dreams spill into waking life with messages that cannot be ignored. You begin to sense that life is not random, but patterned, guided by an intelligence that flows through your psyche and into the world around you. This is what I called synchronicity, the meaningful alignment of inner and outer events. The empath, once reconnected, becomes exquisitely attuned to these synchronistic threads. You might think this makes life more magical. And in many ways it does, but it also makes life more purposeful. You no longer drift aimlessly. You sense when to move, when to pause, when to trust, when to release. You feel the subtle nudges of the unconscious guiding your steps. You are not following a map. You are following the interior constellations of your own psyche. This is why intuition strengthens after healing spiritual disconnection. The empath who once absorbed the emotions of others without boundaries now receives messages from the self with crystal clarity. The empath who once feared their own depths now walks confidently through the inner forest. The empath who once doubted their perception now recognizes truth the moment it appears. Intuition becomes not an occasional spark, but a steady flame. It illuminates your path, it protects you, it reveals what your ego cannot see, and above all, it reconnects you to the soul. And now, as we enter the final arc of this inner pilgrimage, I want you to understand something essential. The healing of spiritual disconnection is not merely a psychological adjustment. It is an initiation, a passage from one mode of being to another, from fragmentation to coherence, from chaos to meaning, from self-loss to self-actualization. For the empath, this healing marks the moment when the psyche ceases to be a battlefield for conflicting energies and becomes instead a sacred vessel through which the self expresses its wisdom. Intuition, in this state, is not a whisper you strain to hear. It is a river you learn to trust. You may recall times in your life when you felt a deep inner knowing yet dismissed it. Perhaps because it contradicted what others believed, or because it threatened to disrupt the roles you felt obligated to maintain. These dismissals, small betrayals of your inner truth, accumulate over years until the voice of intuition grows faint. But when you heal the disconnection, the psyche forgives your past betrayals. The inner voice does not hold grudges. It simply waits for you to listen again. This waiting is critical. The unconscious is patient, infinitely patient. But when you finally turn inward, when you descend into the symbolic depths with sincerity, the response is immediate. It is as though the inner world had been holding its breath, waiting for your return. And when you return, something ancient stirs. The archetypes awaken not as abstract ideas, but as living forces shaping your perception, guiding your instincts, sharpening your intuition with mythic precision. It is in this stage that many empaths begin to dream of animals, mountains, oceans, fire symbols of power, transformation, and primordial intelligence. These are not fantasies. They are manifestations of the collective, unconscious speaking through imagery, because imagery is the native language of the soul. When your intuition strengthens, you no longer fear these images. You recognize them as messengers. You begin to interpret your dreams not as random sequences, but as coded guidance. You start to sense that your inner life is in conversation with something vast, something timeless, something that transcends the individual ego, yet expresses itself through you. One woman told me of a dream that changed her life. She stood at the edge of a desert at twilight. The sun had just fallen behind the horizon, and the sky was a deep violet. Before her lay an endless expanse of sand. Silent and still, she felt both awe and dread. Suddenly, a single star appeared in the sky, brighter than any she had seen. It pulsed like a heartbeat. When she began to walk toward it, the sand beneath her feet turned to light. She woke trembling, with tears on her face. To her, this dream was mysterious, but to the psyche, it was perfectly clear. The desert represented the inner emptiness of her disconnection. The twilight symbolized the transition between the old and the emerging self. The single star was the self, the guiding center, calling her to move forward, and the sand turning to light was a transformation that occurs when one follows intuition. For the path of intuition is not always visible until you begin walking it. This is the paradox. Intuition does not demand certainty. It demands movement. It requires trust in what cannot yet be seen. When the empath regains spiritual connection, this trust becomes natural. You no longer need to analyze every decision. You do not need to wait for permission from the external world. You do not need to justify your knowing. You simply sense the inner direction and follow it, because you finally trust the compass within you. But let us speak honestly about fear. For fear is the greatest adversary of intuition. Spiritual disconnection often occurs not because you lack intuition, but because you fear its implications. You fear what it will reveal. You fear the changes it will demand. You fear the boundaries it will force you to set. You fear the truth it will insist you acknowledge, especially the truths that challenge your identity, your attachments, your loyalties. Many empaths unconsciously silence their intuition because intuition threatens the fragile harmony they have constructed with the world around them. Yet harmony built on self-abandonment is not harmony. It is imprisonment. And the soul will not tolerate imprisonment for long. It will create cracks, fatigue, anxiety, confusion, numbness, until the facade collapses. When it collapses, the empath often interprets this as failure, but this collapse is liberation. It is the psyche refusing to live in falseness. The destruction of false harmony is the prerequisite for the creation of true alignment, and once true alignment begins, intuition resurfaces with a clarity that feels almost supernatural. The empath, who once second-guessed every internal signal, now finds that inner truth asserts itself unambiguously. You feel it in the body as a contraction or a release, a warmth or chill. You feel it in the chest as a subtle magnet pulling you toward what nourishes you and repelling you from what distorts you. You feel it in your dreams, in synchronicities, in the quiet sense of recognition that arises when something resonates with your deeper nature. This resonance is the language of the self. It does not shout, it vibrates, and you, the empath, once spiritually disconnected, now attuned to your inner world, become sensitive to this vibration. You feel the alignment, not as an idea, but as a living sensation. Intuition ceases to be something you think about and becomes something you inhabit. At this stage of healing, The empath often encounters the archetype of the inner guide, the wise old man, the sage woman, the inner father, the anima or animus in its integrated form. These figures appear not only in dreams, but also in moments of deep reflection, intuitive insight, or symbolic encounter. They are manifestations of your expanded consciousness. They are not external spirits, but internal intelligences drawn from the deepest layers of the psyche. One man described to me a vision during meditation in which he saw an old man sitting beside a river. The man wore a cloak made of starlight and held a lantern filled with water. He looked at the dreamer and said, "The truth flows when you stop trying to control the current." This message transformed the man's relationship with intuition. He realized that intuition is not something to force or chase. It is something that flows when the ego releases its grip. This release is central to healing. The empath's ego is often delicate because it has been shaped in response to the needs and emotions of others. But when spiritual reconnection occurs, the ego begins to strengthen, not through domination, but through alignment with the self. A healthy ego does not block intuition. It safeguards. It does not override inner truth. It carries it into the world with courage and clarity. As this alignment deepens, another transformation occurs. Boundaries become natural. The empath, who once absorbed the world unconsciously, now interacts with it consciously. Intuition reveals not only what is true, but what is healthy. It shows you whom to trust, whom to release, what environments nurture your essence, what environments drain it. Boundaries cease to be acts of resistance and become acts of coherence. You no longer set boundaries to protect yourself from others. You set them to protect the clarity of your inner connection. And as boundaries strengthen, sensitivity becomes wisdom instead of burden. The empath who once felt overwhelmed by the emotions of others now becomes a mirror that reflects truth rather than absorbing it. You sense the hidden patterns in human behavior, not to carry them, but to understand them. You feel the emotional undercurrents of a situation, not to drown in them, but to navigate them with awareness. You become attuned not only to suffering, but to potential, not only to pain, but to transformation. This is the true power of empathic intuition, the ability to perceive what is becoming, not only what is. You begin to sense the unfolding future in the present moment. You feel the seeds of destiny before they sprout. You recognize the archetypal forces moving within a person long before they become conscious of them. This does not make you prophetic in a mystical sense. It makes you perceptive in a psychological sense. You see the direction of the psyche because you are no longer disconnected from your own, and so life becomes different. You walk through the world with an inner calm, an inner knowing, an inner authority. You are no longer frightened by the unknown because the unknown is now familiar, the place where your intuition lives, the place where your soul speaks, the place where meaning unfolds to heal spiritual disconnection is to return home, to strengthen intuition, is to remember who you are beneath the noise of the world. To be an empath is not to suffer endlessly, but to perceive deeply. And when an empath heals, that depth becomes a source of power, clarity, and transformation. You become someone who listens not only with the ears but with the soul. Someone who sees not only with the eyes but with the unconscious. Someone who understands not only the outer world but the inner forces shaping it. And in this understanding, your life is no longer a reaction to external circumstances. It becomes a dialogue with a self, ongoing, intimate, meaningful, and profoundly alive. This is what happens when the empath heals the spiritual disconnection. Not only does intuition strengthen, it becomes the guiding star of your existence. The inner light that turns every step into an act of alignment, every decision into an expression of truth, and every moment into a revelation